For the last few years, I've been leading some research on trying to understand the white-tailed deer problem in northeast Alberta. So deer have been expanding throughout the boreal forest. We suspect that they probably always occurred there in some sort of low levels, scattered here and there, but nothing like we see today. Today, white-tailed deer are spread across the Alberta boreal forest. They're now up into the Yukon, they're up into the Northwest Territories, they're up into the mountains. An unrelated study, I went and did a camera survey of the Wilmore Wilderness, and white-tailed deer were the most numerous things we found, even up in the high alpine. And this isn't an Alberta or Western Canadian novelty. White-tailed deer are this amazing species. They've evolved in the Carolinas and spread all the way down to the Florida Keys and then all the way up into the subarctic boreal. They're basically the coyote of the ungulate world, exhibiting this incredible phenotypic plasticity that allows them to adapt to changing conditions. So the question is, what are the changing conditions in the boreal forest that have allowed white-tailed deer to suddenly become successful here? The research motivation behind this is, of course, dwindling caribou herds. One of the primary reasons for caribou declines is, of course, increasing wolf numbers. So it's believed, and I think the evidence is pretty tight and emerging further, that with increasing white-tailed deer populations, these are feeding the wolves, which are subsequently increasing and then suppressing woodland caribou populations in a classic apparent competition scenario, basically a teeter-totter with wolves as the fulcrum. So if we hope to do something to stem woodland caribou declines, then ostensibly we need to do something about the white-tailed deer that are contributing to this problem. But what? So for the last couple of years, I've been presenting on some camera-based research that we conducted in the northeast boreal forest, where we put a camera array out in the landscape to survey the presence of white-tailed deer through time over a span of 3 winters. And we showed that while white-tailed deer do respond negatively to severe winters, we found that they rebound again really quickly. So a little bit about deer biology. White-tailed deer in the wintertime, they're not geared for winter. This is a Carolinian species. They do really, really well down in Florida. In the winter, they don't do so well. But they do have adaptations to cope with winter. So they enter what's called controlled starvation. So basically, they start to utilize their own body tissues, first the fat and then eventually the proteins, and they hope that they have enough to get them through the winter so that once the snow clears, there's enough of their body left that they can then engage with the new food resources that are growing up after snow melt and then survive that winter. So they're basically doing 2 things in the winter. They're trying to find enough food to give them some extra boost to their reserves, and they're trying to minimize the amount of energy they have to expend. And the energy expenditure is really based on the amount of snow they have to plow through. Unlike caribou, which have those beautiful hooves that splay and allow them to run across the snow, white-tailed deer have those little hooves that just go junk right through the snow, and you often see them on the cameras up to their necks, just plowing along through the snow. It looks really uncomfortable, but it also incurs this massive energetic cost. So the working hypothesis that we've generated is that white-tailed deer are persisting even after really severe winters. Sure, it is true that we're getting more moderate winters, and we've shown that under moderate winters there's no change in white-tailed deer population size or distribution. Under a severe winter, there is a marked drop in white-tailed deer populations by about half, but then they rebound again fairly quickly. So our working hypothesis is that this rebound is probably due to this huge early cereal forage subsidy that we're providing on this landscape. So we're knocking down a lot of mature forest, which is really no good to deer at all, and replacing it with shrubs and grasses on these anthropogenic footprints, which is really good for deer. So the camera-based research tended to support this hypothesis, so then we wanted to ask some more fine-scale questions about white-tailed deer behavioral response to some of these anthropogenic features. And to do this, we used some classic methods, capture and satellite telemetry. We focused on white-tailed deer does, females, because that's the reproductive component of the population, right? That's the one that's actually maintaining this population. So we want to know how these females are responding to these features. We learned early on in 2012 that capturing white-tailed deer in the boreal forest is a very, very difficult endeavor. So for the same reasons that makes them really hard to aerially survey, because you've got that really dense canopy, it makes them really hard to catch by helicopter. So we contracted a helicopter company, often used in Alberta, to come and capture 30 deer for us, which they thought they could do in about a week. And during that time, they caught 6. And unfortunately, every one of those collars subsequently failed within a couple of days due to technical reasons. In 2013, they tried again, confident they could catch 30. They caught 5. 4 of these died almost immediately thereafter. And we strongly suspect it's because, again, these animals are living they're basically on the knife edge throughout the whole winter time. So being pushed by the helicopter and being handled probably just pushed them over that edge. So it didn't make those animals really useful to us. We did have much more success with clover traps, however, ground-based trapping. We clover trapped throughout the winter of 2013, again in 2014, ended up capturing 29 females, which we collared, a bunch of males and fawns and things like that we let go with some recaptures. And actually our capture success was really, really high compared to other studies in the West. So ultimately, between the helicopter captures and the ground captures, we deployed collars on 40 female white-tailed deer across the study area. So the study area was right here in the northeast boreal forest in the area around Winifred and Christina Lakes. You'll see that Conklin is there, Chard to the north, and all of this is south of Fort McMurray. This is the study area where we've been working with Alberta Environment Parks on the study. I should mention this is a joint project between Innovates and Alberta Environment and Parks. So they bought the collars and they were our partners on the project, and generally supported by PTAC and by MEG. So we put these collars out, and each of these colors is a color-coded individual. So the first thing I want you to notice is that pattern, which is really, really cool. What this means is that some of these animals in the wintertime bolted and headed for the hills. We got a few of them that headed west, some of them that headed south, and some of them that headed east off into Saskatchewan. Not all of them are some of them. And this is a phenomenon called conditional migration, which again is one of these really plastic, cool responses by deer. So unlike caribou, which kind of either do migrate or don't migrate for the most part, white-tailed deer choose to migrate in any given winter based on winter severity, usually based on snow depth. So sometimes they do migrate, sometimes they don't. And even in those years when there is some migration to a wintering grounds, some of them will go and some of them will not. And it's an area of ongoing research why this is. But first of all, this is a really common phenomenon apparently in boreal environments. I say common in that it's been looked in one other place, that's New Brunswick, and they found the same thing. So New Brunswick deer are operating the same way as Alberta boreal deer, which is pretty interesting. We found that deer survival was really quite variable. So this is the number of days that each of our deer survived through time. Some of them lasted only a couple of days. Most of those were the helicopter captures. About a third of them lasted less than a year before they died, and about a third of them survived past a year, going into 2 and even more years than that. Most of these mortalities occurred in the late winter period, as we expected. So whitetails do pretty well throughout the summer, throughout the fall. Even in early winter, things aren't so bad, but it's that March, April period when things really catch up with them, right? They're really living on the knife edge, and some of them make it and some of them don't. Some of these mortalities that we documented were based on were obviously carnivore kills, right? Wolf kills. We did not do a systematic mortality assessment. We didn't have the funds to do that, so this is anecdotal. But all those mortality sites we were able to visit, basically things landed in 2 places, 3 places. Either we couldn't tell, it could have been carnivores or it could have been scavenging, or it was obviously a wolf kill. But we actually found a lot of deer like this. Deer that had just dropped in their traces and died. They're obviously in really bad shape. They had no body fat. They just didn't make it through that energetically expensive winter. But interestingly, based on the camera work, a lot of the deer did make it, and the deer that did make it, most of them produced fawns, a lot of them produced twins or even triplets, suggesting that the females that do make it, they do really well and they're quite prolific after the fact. So deer Deer survival was quite variable. So this graph shows on the x-axis each of the individual deer, and then the 3-year period in which we studied. So we basically had time segments in which each of these deer was collared through time. And so we could use that telemetry data from each of these time segments to do a resource selection function. So again, a pretty classic method in which we lay all of our deer telemetry points across the landscape. Laura's already done a great job of explaining this. We randomly select a bunch of points that deer could have been at but were not, and then we relate that to a bunch of different landscape features. So in this case, we related it to natural landscape features derived from Alberta Vegetation Index data. We thought that deer are likely responding to upland deciduous forest because that's what they do everywhere else. We thought that understory was also going to be important. We related the locations to ABMI human footprint data. So mostly out of this data set, we derive the polygonal features that are out there in the landscape. So things like your well sites, your industrial block sites, cut blocks, basically anything that has a shape to it, in which we hypothesized, I should say, that it's these features that are providing these little smorgasbords of early cereal vegetation dotted conveniently throughout the landscape in this matrix of mature forest, right? So you've got this juxtaposition of food as well as escape cover in the forest from predators. And the final data set was linear features layer that was produced by the University of Alberta and ABMI, which was contemporary to our study. So in this area, there's a lot of 3D seismic, a lot of legacy seismic, a lot of other very active oil exploration going on. So we created a whole series of hypotheses based on how we thought deer might be reacting to these different features. And so this is a list of our different variables right here. Each of these models corresponded to a different hypothesis, right? Are deer responding mostly to these polygonal block features as forage subsidies? Are they avoiding linear features as wolf highways? Are they mostly sticking to upland deciduous forest with lots of cover as a juxtaposition of food and escape cover? Each of these hypotheses represented by a model which we used a linear regression approach to test these models, which generated an Ikeiki's information score. And of course, the lower the AIC score, the better supported the model. So at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, we have the ability to discern which of these variables best explains white-tailed deer selection or avoidance across that landscape, and allows us to target which of these landscape features is most important in explaining where deer are spending their time throughout this period. So we started off by taking all of these points and from all the individuals and dumping them into a big pool across all 3 years that we had data for to create annual resource selection functions. So this does not discriminate deer selection within different seasons. It just says, on the whole, across seasons, where are deer in really broad general terms. And we asked, are deer mostly responding to forest understory? And if so, they would have a low AIC score, or conversely a really high AIC weight, which is a number between 0 and 1 that describes the probability that model is the best. So you see forest understory there gets a score of 0, so that's not the best explainer of deer. Forest overstory gets a 0, seg-D features gets a 0, linear block features all get 0. So it's not that we can ascribe a particular resource sector to explaining why deer are there. Instead, the cumulative effects model, which includes elements of all these different sectors, is the best supported model. Meaning that white-tailed deer aren't necessarily just honing in to, say, 3D seismic or to cut blocks or something like that. They're responding to the whole suite of things that we are doing on that landscape. So the green here is the stuff that white-tailed deer are selecting, and the gray is the stuff that white-tailed deer are avoiding. And the parameter estimate is the strength of that interaction. So if it's a very large positive or large negative number, it's a very strong selection or avoidance. So first off, white-tailed deer are responding very, very positively to forest cut blocks, which really good news for us. That tells us we didn't screw up this analysis too badly. We know that forest cut blocks are deer makers, so that was our benchmark check. We're good. Move on. What else are they doing? We know that they're associated with aspen forest. So again, that's a check. we found that they're very strongly selecting high-density industrial sites. So these are the several hundred or 1,000-person camps out there, basically anywhere where there's active activity going on that creates a big polygonal feature. They're selecting those very, very strongly. They're also selecting, to some degree, 3D seismic on this landscape. While at the same time, white-tailed deer are strongly avoiding trails, truck trails, roads, and pipelines, which was one of our working hypotheses. We think that if these are in fact wolf highways, it's in deer's best interest to not be anywhere near those things. They're also avoiding well sites, which we did not predict. We thought that there was going to be a fairly strong association with well sites, well pads in this landscape as those pieces of smorgasbord. Now if we go and so there's a picture of like a typical high-density industrial site out there where the mature forest is all gone and it's all been replaced by a lot of shrub and a lot of grasses that make really good forage for deer. So the real question is, what are they doing in the wintertime? Right? This is the period that's so critical for deer. This is our main hypothesis, that we're putting a lot of stuff in the landscape that's getting them through the winter that they wouldn't have had otherwise, they have not had historically. So these are preliminary results around winter resource selection functions. This is hot off the press as of yesterday. So I'm going to put a big tentative preliminary stamp on this. Don't hold me to any of this because we have to retest these variables and validate. But here's what it's looking so far. In fact, you get a change in the relationships from the annual RSF to the winter time. So in winter, we found a really strong positive association with 3D seismic, a positive association with well sites, and again, that positive association with high-density industrial, negative association with cut blocks, legacy cut lines, roads, trails, and a suite of other things. So what this tends to suggest is that there's probably a shift in what deer are doing in the wintertime versus what they're doing year-round. Then our next step is to try to cut this cake differently and look at summer, fall versus winter RSFs to get a more precise picture of how deer are changing their landscape use. But the preliminary results do tend to suggest that there is a strong association with some of these sources of early cereal vegetation that we're putting on that landscape in the wintertime. So in addition, our next steps are to conduct some integrated step selection functions. So unlike a resource selection function, which is just a dot on the map, was the deer here or was it over here? Integrated step selection functions instead look at the actual movement trail of those deer. So I've got some of them mapped out here in relation to some of the industrial features on that landscape. So we want to ask, do deer actually move into some of these areas that provide a high forage subsidy, such as well pads and cut blocks industrial sites, in the winter time? Is their movement different depending on the severity of the winter? And are linear features facilitating movement by deer? So we notice that a lot of things like to move down these seismic lines besides wolves. Deer are there, even though statistically there's an avoidance. Moose are there. What is the role in these linear features in affecting white-tailed deer movement, especially in the winter when movement is so energetically costly for them? So some preliminary big blue stamp take-home messages. It appears that deer behaviorally responding by strongly selecting cut blocks, these high-density industrial sites and 3D cut lines. Year-round, they're avoiding a bunch of linear features. In winter, there was a strong selection for pipelines, well sites, and truck trails. But we really need to dig into that relationship much better before I'm confident in that take-home. But so far, the results are all coming together to suggest that deer use is consistent with our working hypothesis in that they're selecting areas, exploiting areas of early cereal vegetation in these block features, but tending to segregate from linear features where there's a lot of predator activity, presumably. So I was also asked to produce some best management practices, and again, this has a big blue preliminary stamp on this. I would not recommend people run out and change what they're doing based on this. There's a lot more work we have to do to tie it up. One thing I am confident in saying is that reducing deer populations through landscape management should be a priority for both the forest industry and the petroleum industry. So when we went into this, there was a lot of people hypothesized that this was going to be entirely driven by cut blocks and nothing else, and our data is showing really clearly that's just not the case. It could be, if it's shown that industrial sites, well sites, are important in this system, they could be made unpalatable to white-tailed deer, either by planting, fencing, or aversive techniques. Of course, this is based on landscape management. We'll leave the wildlife management out of it. I think there's lots of opportunities for wildlife managers to reduce that population. If it's true that 3D seismic lines are having this positive effect on deer, as it seems to be, and that's a big if, it could be that we might have to target some of that 3D seismic for restoration as well, to keep it out of the hands of deer so that it's not letting them survive these harsh winters. Good news is, I think coming out of this, we could provide some recommendations for anti-deer restoration that could target features that are distant from areas that are already perceived as risky. So if deer are avoiding linear features, then reclaiming polygons next to those linear features doesn't make sense. You'd want to do it in areas where the deer actually are instead of the places they're avoiding. So, and to some extent, this is already being done by the Regional Industrial Caribou collaboration, the RIC team. They're using our deer layer in helping to prioritize areas for restoration. So with that, I'd like to thank CAP, PTAC, AUPRF, Government of Alberta, Meg Energy, and a whole bunch of people who helped with this study. I got a great 3D flyover of the northeast boreal landscape